Welcome viewers to this second lecture on Budhan. In the first lecture, we discussed the term tribe and we discussed the difficulty in any attempt to define the tribe. We also looked at certain aspects of tribal imagination, certain aspects of what literature by the tribal people would carry. Having addressed the complexity of the term tribe, in this second lecture, we are going to look at the term denotified tribe. Now, why is this important? This is important because the play under discussion, that is Budhan, is a play that is written by a denotified tribe. Having first, as I said, addressed the issue of tribe, we now move on to understand and to ask the question as to what is a denotified tribe. And we will also be looking very briefly at literature by denotified tribes. Now, where we find it very difficult to define the term tribe, we seem to have paid hardly any attention to what are understood as denotified tribes. It is abysmal that we are unaware, really speaking, of the implications of tribe and literature by the tribal people, but we seem to be, in fact, mainstream society seems to be in a state of ignorance when it comes to what were known as, earlier known as the criminal tribes, and then they were called the denotified tribes, that is the denotified and nomadic tribes. But before we understand what this process of denotification was, we need to ask what the process of notification was. How is it that certain tribes were categorized under a certain term, and what, really speaking, was this act and was this term? Again, for this, we need to go back to the colonial period in India, where in 1871, an act was passed by the British colonial government, which was for the registration of the criminal tribes and the eunuchs in India. Now, I'm reading the act in toto. Today, we might use a different term to define people, but according to Act 27 for the registration of criminal tribes and eunuchs, it is expedient to provide for, and I will now quote from the Act, the registration, surveillance, and control of certain criminal tribes. This was called the, quotes close, this was called the Criminal Tribes Act or the CTA. So I'm going to refer to this as the CTA. The Criminal Tribes Act or the CTA also meant that a certain tribe would be branded as criminal, which means also that people who were, born into a particular tribe would also be branded such by birth. And this is a very important aspect. The period that we are talking about is 1871, that is the 19th century India, where we are talking about the colonial government. And the act said that in case there is any reason to believe that any tribe, gang, or class of persons is addicted to the systematic commission of non-bailable offences, this may be reported to, the authorities, really speaking. So, the net result of this Act of 1871 was that some people then began to equate the profession with criminality. And the Act mentioned that it must be specified whether the tribe in question, within quotes, has a fixed place of residence, and also if their occupation is, within quotes, lawful. Now, this gives us two very important parameters of defining, really speaking, a tribe that was in the 19th century considered to be placed under the CTA. Now, what are we saying? One, fixed place of residence. That there were tribes that were always on the move. They were the nomadic tribes, non-sedentary tribes. So obviously, non-sedentary tribes could not be, in a sense, put under surveillance of a certain kind, and as a result, their occupation was also considered to be, aberrant, so to say. So, after the publication of, this particular notification, so it was decided that, nobody shall really speaking question, and people who were branded as such, which meant that a lot of tribes, we are looking at nomadic tribes, tribes with mobility, and as a result, tribes that as a result of their mobility were outside the purview of the colonial system. And these could then be branded and categorized as criminal tribes. Now, the nomadic troops were also equated with the whole idea of Thuggy. And, of course, G.N. Devi again, who's edited along with two other people, a book called Narrating Nomadism, raises in the introduction, G.N. Devi raises the question about the DNTs. And he asks a very important question. What is common to DNTs then? And he says that what is common to DNTs is the fate of being branded as born criminals, which means that because of this act in the 19th century, certain tribes and people in that particular tribe had to face this categorization. Now, in the book on very relevant, Devi points out that and calls this a misguided piece of legislation, and he calls the CTA Act of 1871. Now, who were the people covered? As I said, that this act actually brought within its net mostly people who were highly mobile. Who were these people? As G.N. Devi points out, and I quote Devi here, it covered itinerant singers, entertainers, performers, coin makers, snake charmers, acrobats, and such other wandering groups that were semi-peasant and given to seasonal migration. Now, let's kind of analyze this further. So, these are people who are highly mobile. These are people who belong to the realm of tribal culture, because if we are talking about singers, entertainers, performers, then we are talking about culture. Another aspect, acrobats, coin makers, right? So these are people, Devi says, that were semi-peasant, which means that they were not given to fixed agriculture, and they would migrate seasonally from one place to the next. So this created, the CTA then created a situation where people of specific tribes could actually, be called, really speaking, by the law, by the authorities. And according to this act, if it was believed that any member of the tribe that is under the CTA is, involved in any activity that is considered aberrant, then this should be reported. So, the Act also dealt with the issue of how these people are then going to earn their living in future, because if their mobility is going to be restricted and they will have to be answerable to the authorities, in the colonial authorities at the time, then this raised a very valid question. How will these people then earn their living in the future? So in this regard, the Act mentions that it must be specified whether the tribe in question has a fixed place of residence and whether this is lawful or not. And this idea we have discussed in detail. So, the tribes then that lacked, this fixed structure and, they were nomadic, highly mobile, non-sedentary, they were, in a sense, a challenge to the very fixed structure propagated, really speaking, by the powers at the time. And the imperial forces then tried to control this. Now, Devi, as I said, has also kind of related this to the whole idea of, discuss this against the context of Thuggi. Throughout the 19th century, and I'm quoting Devi here, thugs and Thuggi became a consuming obsession for the colonial imagination, ultimately leading to a legislation formulated in order to isolate and reform the communities imagined to be associated with Thuggi. This profoundly misguided piece of legislation was called the CTA. And this, as I mentioned, this covered, Devi points out that it covered singers and entertainers, performers, and so on. But why have we brought in Thuggi here? Now, there is a lot of discussion around Thuggi. There is one view which is considered to be the Orientalist view and a view of the colonizers, of the colonial imagination, that like to categorize people as thugs, people who were outside this net of surveillance and so on. And that was a consuming obsession, as Devi says, for the colonial imagination. There is one aspect, there is one school of thought that believes that there were, the thugs and thuggis were actually there. And there is one that considers it to be a colonial obsession. And there is a third school of thought that probably looks at, both possibilities. But for us, what is important is that the colonial response or creation of Thuggi, in a sense, became the precedent for the CTA. And this created a lot of problems because Thuggi, in a sense, one got to know through Orientalist writings such as Sleeman's diaries. There's Colonel Philip Taylor, and they in their diaries, Sleeman's diaries particularly, this idea of Thuggi and the colonial imagination was mentioned. Now, moving on further, we have the critic Ajay Dandekar, who also connects the CT Act, like Devi, with colonial records of Sleeman's diaries and Colonel Philip Taylor. And the Thuggi Act, in that sense, Dandekar also points out how the Thuggi Act, really speaking, was something that became a precedent, really speaking, to the Criminal Tribes Act. And he specifies how in 1911, and I'm quoting Dandekar here, that a rule was introduced which resonates, with the approaches to, social deviants and criminals. And this was the injunction that all members of declared criminal tribes would have to be fingerprinted at the nearest station and so on and so forth, which meant that there was an attempt at profiling, there was an attempt at branding and profiling, and also as a result of this profiling, restricting the movement of people who were branded as members of a tribe that was branded as criminal. So the act, what was the effect of this act then? It alienated and stigmatized an entire group of people. So as discussed in the previous lecture, we said that, Andhra Patel pointed out how tribes are marked by isolation. But in this sense, tribes that were branded as criminal in the 19th century were then prone to much greater marginalization. And as a result of the CTA, all the members of a tribe would then be seen as, aberrant, as always having the potential to commit a crime. And of course, we should remember that it put together the criminal tribes and the eunuchs, and it provided, Devi says that it provided for confiscation of land and other possessions of the so-called criminal tribes and a forced internment. So, of course, the land would then be taken away, and this forced internment is very important because tribes that were branded as criminal were then placed under settlements. And Devi points out how nearly 200 nomadic communities were brought under the provisions of the City Act, almost 200. So, this is again very, very important for us to understand. What we are doing here is not just understanding the term DNT, but literature that is produced by members of a denotified tribe. We are also going into a historical analysis of what then would be the important aspects of literature that is produced by the DNTs. So, going back to the 19th century, there was this Indian Forest Act of 1865, and the Britishers, of course, had taken over the forest land. And as a takeover of this, as has been mentioned in the first lecture, how the people who resisted this takeover, really speaking, were classified as tribes, and there was a cult of savageology that was used to understand and consider the tribes that were nomadic, especially, as savage. So, as a result, people also started accepting these misplaced perceptions and conveniently accepted the inclusion of more and more tribes to this list in 1891. And Susan Abraham, in an article called Steal or I'll Call You a Thief, Criminal Tribes of India states, and I'm quoting Abraham here, Aboriginal tribes, backward castes and nomadic communities were arbitrarily brought under the purview of the CTA. By the time this dastardly law was repealed in 1952, altogether 153 communities were brought under its stranglehold, quotes close. So, again, there was a report of 2007 that said that there are a lot of people, almost that were classified, and about 313 nomadic, 198 TNTs. Vibha Chauhan, in an article published recently in the book Narrating Nomadism, talks about how the people, when they were asked what is the work they do, they said that they don't work in the conventional sense of it, they just sing and dance. So, if the kind of people who are brought under this categorization are people who are mobile, like musicians, dancers, singers, storytellers, puppeteers, tightrope walkers, communities that entertain the public with the help of animals such as bears and monkeys, snakes, owls, birds, people who worked with their hands. They made things with bamboo, iron, clay, etc. There was a National Advisory Council report that actually refers to all these categories. And so, the Act of 1908 decided to confine them to a specific area. And in 1924, they were given the tag of an ex-criminal tribe. This was coupled with another act that was brought in 1918 called the Restriction of Habitual Offenders Act. So many things that are happening in the pre-independence period, and such acts, really speaking, could be used in any way. And in 1937, when there was a committee under K.M. Munshi that was appointed to define these terms, such as tribe, gang, class, habitual offender, criminal. And then again, this act was repealed in 1948 in Madras and in 1949 in Maharashtra. And this finally culminated, all these efforts to actually, change the terminology culminated in the formulation of the term denotified tribe in 1952. In the post-independence period, it was realized that the colonial period, led to this kind of a complete injustice, really speaking, to the tribes. And in fact, describing the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 as a blot on the law book of free India. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had annulled it after independence, and these communities were henceforth denotified. So, this, really speaking, is the history of the term denotified. Any effort before this was either to kind of, reform them, so to say, reform within quotes in terms of a settled life, where they would be under surveillance, where their acts could be monitored and so on. So the Act understood, rehabilitation, really speaking, as blocking mobility. Again, Susan Abraham also, in her article, talks about, the British colonial mindset that ensured that if there were any, non-sedentary tribes, these should be brought under the net of the CTA. So they also had to, the people then would have to go to the local authorities, and they had to report on a daily basis. So the fact that almost 200 communities were branded as criminal meant that all the people who belonged to these tribes were totally at the mercy of the authorities, and any activity that was considered to be unlawful could then be attributed. And this is actually the background, really speaking, to the play under discussion, which is Budhan. So the tribes, to be referred to as criminal then, would provide an easy solution, really speaking, to people. And in the 19th century, Ajay Dandekar points out, the colonial government concluded that pastoral nomads, itinerant traders, and other unsettled communities were different from settled agriculturalists fixed within domiciles. These wandering communities could not be situated within preconceived slots, and so Dandekar says that they were then located as aberrant factors, and they had to be controlled through the colonial legal institutions. So all these different acts, point out that any literature that is going to come to us from the DNTs would carry within it this potential for mobility. It will also carry with it the pain that they have carried through history of being branded. The denotification is also a reminder, in a sense, of their categorization and being branded as, a criminal category. Milind Bokil, points out that DNTs are not just a neglected section, but also very complex, because their problems are not only grounded in contemporary reality, but they are deeply rooted in history. So when we study the literature that comes to us, from the denotified tribes, we have to pose a certain number of questions. Is the transition from the term criminal tribes to denotified tribes, what really speaking is this transition about? What is the effect that it generated for the people? How productive was it for the people? Will the term DNT allow the people of the concerned tribe to get over the stigma of being brandished as criminal? The next question is, how will they be able to overcome the years spent in the reformatory settlement, a settlement that ensured that they could not move out and that they had to report on a daily basis? So is there any program that allows the tribes, those that were under the CTA net, does it allow the tribes to develop according to their own lines? So we need to understand, in lecture 1 we discussed tribal imagination and how there is a kind of organicity that is presented by the tribal imagination, a fusion at different planes of existence and a fusion at different levels of time. So, the temporal and spatial fusion is something that's part of the tribal imagination. But when we come to literature by tribes that have been earlier classified as criminal and are now known as the DNTs, we need to understand that the orality, because with a non-sedentary approach, the oral quality, really speaking, of the members of this tribe, of the literature that is produced by them, is very, very rich. They would have diverse form and content. So, a series of autobiographies, life narratives by members of this tribe, of these tribes, presents to us the historical angst and anxiety and pain that they have undergone. So we have Upara by Lakshman Mane. Then we have Gabal by Dada Saheb More. We have Uchhalya by Lakshman Gaikwad. We have Berar by Bhimrao Gasti. And all these, we have Kulhatyache by Kulhatyache Por by Kale, depicting life of stone dressers, pickpockets, and village watchmen and dance users. More recently, Sharmila Rege's collection of testimonials, of women also records the life narratives of women who belong to the DNTs like Vimal More. So, the kind of linearity that we expect in terms of a life narrative with narratives coming from the mainstream should not be taken as a trope that should also belong to literature and life narratives, especially by the DNTs. We have to understand that the aesthetics that evolves, in terms of literature by the tribes and literature by the DNTs, that will have an idiom of its own. Each belief, each cultural practice will entail its own formation, really speaking. So, to sum it up, we need to understand that we have discussed in this lecture the implications, first of all, the historical approach to the DNT, to unpack the term denotified and nomadic tribe, to understand what was the notification all about. For this, we went back to the 19th century, that is the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, that was imposed by the colonizers in India, the British colonizers in India, and we understand the implications of the CTA, from the CTA, the transition to the DNT and the Habitual Offenders Act. Of course, the transition being from the CTA to this point was also via the reformatory settlements that bound members of tribes. With this background, this will help us understand how these social cultural attitudes and histories of people are reflected in literature that they produce. Budhan, a play by a denotified tribe, the Chara tribe from Ahmedabad, is a play that presents the anxieties of what, really speaking, it means to be a member of a denotified tribe. Thank you.